In this video, we'll look at the economy of the southern colonies in the 17th century, the development during the 1600s and a little bit into the early 1700s. We're talking about areas south of the Mason-Dixon line, everything from Virginia and Maryland down to Georgia. By the early 1700s, you have Georgia. And of course, like the North, there's some regional variation, the Deep South and the Upper South. The North, I had said, developed an economy that was more integrated, more market and wage based, while the Southern colonies are going to develop much differently than the Northern colonies. A lot of the South had a wide tidewater. That's the rivers where there was actually tides from the ocean, and you can see it in green here in the Virginia colony. And that meant, of course, that it didn't rise up into the mountains quickly, and there's a lot of good arable land. There are also very few really good harbors in the South, but there were really wide rivers, and the South therefore developed a pattern of large landed estates or plantations. In the South, these large landed estates or plantations grew staple crops. And a staple or a cash crop is a crop grown in massive quantities for resale. It's not for the self-consumption. And the result was that the economy was dominated by a few wealthy planters growing crops for international trade. These plantations were self-sufficient except for what they purchased from abroad. As a result, you're going to see, fewer market towns and less internal commerce, less manufacturing, and the economy obviously was much less developed than in the North. I should note, however, that just like in the North, most people in the South were also small subsistent farmers. But whereas the North, the economy was dominated by the urban cities, the economy of the South is dominated by these elite, powerful plantations. Part of the reason the plantations grew up was because they had these wide southern rivers. That meant that ocean-going ships could go up the river a great distance and land at individual estates or plantations. There was less need for our cities. And most plantations had their own wharf. As noted previously, a lot of the colonies in the South were founded by, proprietary grants from the king to rich aristocratic people, or company charter. And so you do not have the communal Puritan working together. It's given the king gives a grant to a rich guy, and the rich guy then welcomes workers onto his plantation. There's also the head right system I'd mentioned earlier, that if the rich guy were to pay for another person coming over, then that rich guy would get an additional 50 acres. And so the land was taken up in large part by these large plantations, as I say. The staple crops demanded a lot of labor, and so these rich guys were always trying to get people to work on their land, and that led, as I mentioned in previous videos, to indentured servants and, again, the head rights. That is how they filled the demand. It wasn't giving individual people plots of a small ownership of land. Of course, the shortage of labor, even things like the indentured servants, couldn't fill the demand. You're going to see the growth of slavery, and slavery is, obviously absolutely critical to the southern plantation system. I'm not going to talk about the growth of slavery in this video. It's too important to put as part of this video. It's a separate video, but obviously slavery is the linchpin, the cornerstone of the whole plantation system. As already noted, tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, that was the first staple crop when John Rolfe learned how to cure tobacco for European taste, as we've mentioned before. Because tobacco quickly depleted the soil, and the fact that land was so cheap, plantation owners just bought more land for their next crop. they would just let their old fields lie fallow, and therefore tobacco increased land concentration among this elite wealthy as well. The most profitable staple or cash crop for areas in the deep south was rice. Rice was first introduced to Carolina colony during the 1660s, but its cultivation didn't succeed until a more hardy variety was imported from Madagascar by John Thurber in the 1690s. Thurber was a sea captain who had traded with Madagascar. Rice couldn't be grown any really north than the southern part of the Carolina colony, which of course meant South Carolina as the colonies developed. The southern part of Carolina colony was swampy and mosquito-infested lowlands, and that was perfect for rice. Rice became popular in Europe where it couldn't be grown, and it was of course also a staple crop in China. Selling at £2 a barrel, over 150,000 barrels were exported from Carolina annually prior to the Revolution. And of course, rice was also a very laborious crop, and it was again supported by the institution of slavery. As the colonial period passed, the Southerners were able to extend the area that was able to grow rice by digging irrigation canals and flooding fields. Later in the colonial period, a new export staple crop emerged that also did well in southern Carolina, indigo. Indigo was a valuable plant because it was used to create a blue dye that was in demand in England's growing clothing and textile businesses. It proved to be the perfect supplement to rice since it could be grown more in the southern uplands, more drier land where rice couldn't grow. I'll talk more about indigo in another video because this is really later than the 17th century, and in the 1600s they weren't able to grow indigo. It was just in the Caribbean. Now, some of you may think when a southern cash crop, you might think of cotton. Of course, cotton is absolutely a key cash crop to the South later, after the Revolution. But there was not much of cultivation of cotton as a cash crop in the colonial era. With fewer towns and roads, plantations were large and virtually self-sufficient from what they needed from America. The owner would ensure smaller foodstuffs were grown for workers on the plantation to eat. Obviously, after crop rotation was figured out, they planted foodstuffs in what would have been the fallow fields. The owner employed people with necessary skills and crafts, like cooks, carpenters, bookkeepers, and slave overseers. But most of the labor on these large plantations was done by slaves. Livestock was employed, but often branded early in the 1600s and let just roam on nearby open lands. Later in the colonial period in the 18th century, they fenced in their livestock more. But obviously the cattle and stuff would provide the meat, milk, and leather, I mentioned in regard to the North as well. Plantations often brewed their own beer, or they made their own wine, and buildings included not only the owner's mansion, and it generally was a mansion, but slave quarters, barns, warehouses. As I said, there was a wharf on the river. It was a complex, developed business operation. And this picture here is taken from a tourist brochure on a plantation that's obviously a tourist site today. So you wouldn't be able to see the Walcom House there or the restrooms in the real plantation. With the profits from the sale of their staple crops, the plantation owners could then buy from Europe all the luxury items and products that they didn't have in America. Things like fine clothes or fine furniture, silver, and so forth. The children of the elite would often go to school in England. Of course, the elite used their wealth and education to perpetuate their aristocratic dominance. The rich plantation owners would dominate the colonial legislatures and help pass laws that favored their own economic interest. The poor subsistence farmers, indeed, as I've noted earlier, who were the most numerically in both the North and the South, they got screwed and had trouble competing with these large plantations economically. So in concluding on talking about the South and the Southern economy, I want to talk about it fit better into the mercantilistic system, and this is really important. The South, these plantation owners would buy things they couldn't get in America from Europe, and then sell back to Europe the cash crops that Europe needed, and it was perfect mercantilism. In the North, when they were developing all these artisans and manufacturing, they're producing more what they need. They don't need to buy it from Europe, and they're not exporting things directly that Europe needed. So it didn't fit well into the mercantilistic system. It's important to understand that the southern colonies were better suited to mercantilism than the northern colonies, and that's going to play out in things like the Revolution. This concludes the video on the development of the southern economy and largely focusing on the 17th century.